HOA built 96 houses on my land. I waited quietly. Day after day, I watched the trucks, the noise, the walls going up. Everyone thought I was crazy for staying silent. But silence was my weapon. They laughed at me, they mocked me, they thought I had nothing. Until one day, I walked into court and pulled out a single piece of paper. That moment changed everything. And what happened next? You will never forget. Welcome, my friends, to HOA Stories. I'm John Miller. I live right here in the heart of Arizona. And for years, I've been fighting HOAs and telling the stories they don't want you to hear. If you're new here, make yourself at home. And if you're over 50, like many of us, you know these battles are real. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Think of it like adding another good neighbor to your street. And before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? I still remember that morning. The sun was just coming up over the Arizona desert, and I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee in my hand. The air was still cool, quiet, peaceful. But then, down the hill, I heard it again, the sound of engines, heavy trucks rolling in. I looked out, and what I saw made my heart pound. Rows of houses, dozens of them, standing tall on land that I knew was mine. 96 homes. 96 roofs, walls, windows. All standing on soil that my father had left to me. I didn't say a word. I didn't run out there screaming. I didn't call the police. I just stood there, silent, watching. Why? Because silence was my plan. Silence was the sharpest tool I had. You see, the land was mine. Legally. I had the deed locked away, safe and sound. But the HOA, they thought they were smarter than me. They believed if they built fast enough, strong enough, and bold enough, that I would just give up. That I would look at those houses and say, well, maybe it's theirs now. But they were wrong. Very wrong. I watched the walls go up. I watched the streets get paved. I watched families move into those houses, kids riding bikes, sprinklers watering green grass. And every time someone waved at me, I waved back. I smiled like nothing was wrong. I was the quiet man on the hill, and they thought I was harmless. But inside me, every single day, the fire grew hotter. This was my land, my blood, my history. And they had stolen it right in front of my eyes. The HOA president, I'll never forget his face. A tall man, slick hair, suit always pressed, he loved to brag. He told everyone at the community meeting, "We built this. We made this happen. No one can stop us now." And the people clapped. They believed him. They looked at me like I was just some old man holding on to the past. But I had something they didn't have. Patience. And the truth. Do you know what it feels like to watch somebody take from you, while you stand there smiling? It burns inside, it cuts deep, but at the same time, it gives you power. Because when you stay silent, the other side relaxes. They drop their guard. They think the fight is over. But really, it's only just beginning. Some nights I couldn't sleep. I'd sit at the kitchen table, the deed spread out in front of me. The paper was old, a little yellow around the edges, but the ink was clear as day. My father's name. My name. My land. I would trace my finger over the letters and whisper to myself, they don't even know what's coming. The HOA kept building. First one street, then another, then a clubhouse, fences, signs. They were so proud, they even built a stone wall at the entrance. Big letters carved in it, Ridgeline Heights. I drove past that sign once, slow enough to read it. And I smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. That sign stood on land they did not own. People asked me, "Why aren't you fighting this? Why don't you stop them?" I just said, "Not yet." And they shook their heads, thinking I had given up. But I hadn't given up. I was waiting for the right moment. For the moment when their pride would be at its peak, when they would feel untouchable, when the fall would hurt the most. I kept my life simple. I worked, I paid my bills, I lived quietly in my house on the hill. But every day, when I looked down at those 96 homes, I felt the weight of history on my shoulders. It wasn't just about dirt and grass. It was about my family. It was about respect. It was about not letting bullies win. The HOA president would sometimes pass by my property. He'd wave, smile, and once he even said, "Beautiful view, isn't it? You should thank us, we made it better down there." I nodded and said nothing. But inside, I was thinking, "You fool, you built a castle on sand." The day would come. I knew it. And when it did, all their arrogance, all their confidence, would crumble in one single moment. And let me tell you something, waiting for that moment was the hardest part. Because every day, I had to pretend. Pretend that it didn't hurt. Pretend that I didn't care. Pretend that I wasn't planning the biggest move of my life. But I was. And when that moment came, it was more powerful than anything I could have imagined. But I'll get to that. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, standing on your porch, watching 96 houses being built on your land, would you have stayed silent like I did, or would you have fought back right away? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know, what would you have done? I told you, waiting was the hardest part. Every morning I woke up to the same sound, trucks, hammers, saws, and the echo of workers shouting to each other. They were not just building houses, they were building a lie. And I let them. I let them believe they were in control. I let them believe the land was theirs. And the more they built, the more powerful I felt, because I knew the truth sat in my drawer, on one simple piece of paper. The deed. The proof. The weapon that could end it all. But I didn't rush. I waited, because timing was everything. The HOA was so proud of themselves. They had meetings every week at the new clubhouse. I went to one of those meetings once. Not as a member, but as a quiet guest sitting in the back row. The president stood at the front, wearing his expensive suit, smiling like a king in his castle. He told the crowd, "This community is the future. Ridgeline Heights will be the pride of the state. We built it from the ground up, and no one can take it from us." And the people cheered. Applause filled the room. They believed every word. I sat there with my hands folded, staring at him, thinking, "You have no idea that you are cheering on stolen land. You have no idea that your castle is built on someone else's foundation." After the meeting, one of the board members walked up to me. He leaned close and said, "You should sell your hill property to us. We'll give you a fair price. It's better than hanging on to old dirt." I smiled politely. But inside, my blood was boiling. Fair price? This wasn't about money. This was about justice. This was about my family's name, written in ink on a deed they thought didn't exist. So I stayed silent, and I waited. The more they bragged, the stronger I became. The more they laughed at me, the closer I got to victory. Because pride always comes before the fall, and their pride was sky high. Weeks turned into months. The houses filled with families. Kids laughed in the yards, dogs barked behind fences, garage doors opened and closed. It looked like a perfect neighborhood. Perfect on the outside, but rotten at the core. I knew it couldn't go on forever. One day, a letter came to my mailbox. It was from the HOA. They told me, in bold words, that my land would soon be rezoned for community use. They said if I didn't cooperate, they would take legal action. I laughed out loud when I read it. They wanted to threaten me, on my own land. They had no idea that I was the one holding the real power. That letter, that was the moment I knew the time had come. I folded it, put it in my pocket, and walked over to my desk. I opened the drawer, and there it was, the deed, clean and sharp, the paper that held their future in its lines. I looked at it and whispered, "It's time." I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one who understood land rights, one who fought against big organizations before. I showed him the deed, the history, the proof. He looked at me, smiled, and said the words I had been waiting to hear. You own it. Every inch. And we're going to prove it in court. My heart raced, but I also felt calm. Like a man who had been waiting in the shadows for years, finally stepping into the light. The court date was set. The HOA still didn't know what was coming. They thought they had scared me into silence. They thought they were untouchable. The morning of the trial, I put on my best jacket. I walked slowly into that courthouse, carrying nothing but a thin folder. Inside it, the deed. The document that would decide everything. When I entered the courtroom, the HOA president was already there with his team of lawyers. They laughed, whispering to each other, pointing at me like I was a joke. One of them even said loud enough for me to hear, "This will be quick. He's got nothing." But I had everything. The judge walked in. We all stood. And then it began. Their lawyers spoke first. They painted a picture of progress, of community, of pride. They said the houses were already built, families were already living there, and that I had no right to interfere. I stayed quiet, listening, letting them talk themselves deeper into the hole. And then it was my turn. My lawyer stood tall, opened the folder, and placed the deed on the judge's desk. The room went silent. You could hear the sound of papers turning. The judge read carefully, his eyes moving slowly across the words. Finally, he looked up and asked the HOA one simple question. Do you have any proof this land belongs to you? The president shifted in his seat. His face turned red. He stuttered, whispered to his lawyer, but no words came out. Because they had no proof. No deed. No claim. Nothing. And that was the moment. I knew victory was mine. The silence in that courtroom was heavy. The same silence I had carried for months, now it was theirs to feel. But let me pause here and ask you something. If you were sitting in that courtroom, watching the HOA freeze as the truth hit them like a hammer, what would you be thinking in that exact moment? Would you feel anger at them, or would you feel satisfaction watching them crumble? Tell me down in the comments, because I want to know exactly what you would feel. The judge's eyes were fixed on that deed. The room was quiet, so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. The HOA president shifted in his seat, his lawyers leaned in, whispering fast, their faces pale. They had walked into that courtroom with pride, but pride was melting right in front of me. The judge cleared his throat. He looked at me, then back at them, and said slowly, "This document shows clear ownership, legal, valid, and binding." My heart pounded in my chest, because in that single moment, the balance of power flipped. The HOA president tried to speak. He stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, there has been a misunderstanding. This land is part of our community project, we've invested millions." The judge cut him off. Investment does not replace ownership. Show me your deed. Show me your legal claim. The president froze. His lawyers looked down at their papers, but there was nothing there. They had no deed. They had no claim. They had nothing but arrogance. I could feel the eyes in that courtroom turning toward me. Neighbors, community members, even people who had once laughed at me. Now they looked at me with a different kind of silence, respect, maybe even fear. The HOA president's voice cracked as he tried again. "But, Your Honor, families are living in those homes, children go to school there, this neighborhood is thriving." The judge leaned forward, his voice firm. "You built on land you did not own. That is not thriving. That is trespassing." Those words hit the room like thunder. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself, because for months I had dreamed of this very moment. The truth, finally spoken out loud. Not whispered in my kitchen at night. Not hidden in a drawer. But declared in front of everyone. The HOA president's face turned red. He sat down hard in his chair, his head low. The arrogance, gone. The smile, gone. The king of the castle had been stripped bare in front of his people. My lawyer turned to me and whispered, "We've won." But still, I waited. Because I knew it wasn't over until the judge's gavel came down. The judge flipped through a few more papers, then looked at me. "You are the rightful owner of this land," he said clearly. "The HOA has no legal standing here. Every home, every structure, is on your property." A shiver ran down my spine. There it was. Victory. The moment I had been waiting for. But the story didn't end there. The HOA tried one last desperate move. One of their lawyers stood and argued. "Your Honor, surely we can reach a settlement. Surely this man will accept financial compensation. Surely he cannot intend to take all of this back." All eyes turned to me. Every homeowner in that courtroom stared, waiting for my answer. Would I sell? Would I walk away with money? Would I forgive what they had done? I stood slowly. I looked at the judge, then at the HOA board, then at the people sitting in the crowd. And I said, in the clearest voice I could find, "This is not about money. This is about my family's land. This is about respect." They took from me without asking, and now they must face the price of their choices. The lawyers sat down. The president's hands trembled. The courtroom was still. The judge nodded once, then lifted the gavel. It struck the wood with a sharp crack that echoed in the air. Case ruled in favor of the landowner. Deed confirmed. HOA has no rights to the property. And just like that, it was done. But the silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt before. Because this wasn't just a piece of land anymore. This was 96 houses. This was families. This was lives built on a lie. And now, it all belonged to me. As I walked out of the courthouse, people whispered. Some looked at me with anger, others with shock, and some even with admiration. But the HOA president, he couldn't look at me at all. He kept his eyes down, his steps quick, as if he wanted to escape the weight of his own defeat. I stepped outside into the sunlight. For months, I had stood in shadows, waiting, planning, watching. Now, I stood tall in the open, holding my deed in my hand. It was over. Or maybe, it was only beginning. Because the real question now was, what would I do with 96 homes that were suddenly mine? Would I keep them? Sell them? Tear them down? I had power, but I also had responsibility. And that thought stayed with me, heavier than the silence, sharper than the victory. But tell me this, if it were you, standing outside that courthouse, holding the deed, knowing 96 houses now belong to you, what would you do? Would you keep them all, or would you make the HOA pay in a way they'd never forget? When I stepped out of that courthouse, the sun felt hotter than ever before. The air was dry, sharp, almost burning on my skin, but I felt alive. In my hand was the deed. The same paper they laughed at. The same proof they thought didn't exist. And now, it had turned their entire world upside down. I should have felt nothing but victory, but strangely, I felt something else too. The weight of it. The weight of 96 homes, 96 families, 96 lives suddenly tied to me. Because it wasn't just dirt and fences anymore. It was people. Children who had painted their rooms. Parents who had planted flowers in their yards. Grandparents who had moved in hoping for peace. And now, all of them were living on my land. As I walked to my truck, I could feel eyes following me. Some people from the community had been in the courtroom. They whispered, stared, shook their heads. One woman muttered, "That's the man, he's the reason we might lose our home." Her voice stung, because I hadn't built this mess. The HOA had. But in their eyes, I was the villain now. The quiet man who had stayed in the shadows, then struck like lightning. I started my truck, the engine growling under me, and drove back up the hill to my house. From there, I looked down once again at those rows of houses. Same view, but everything felt different now. Because legally, all of it was mine. The phone started ringing that night. First, my lawyer. He congratulated me again, reminded me of the next legal steps. But then came the other calls, angry voices, desperate voices, voices filled with fear. Homeowners. One man shouted at me, "You can't do this. We paid for our home. We built our lives here." I answered calmly, "You should talk to your HOA. They're the ones who built on land they didn't own." Silence on the line. Then a slam as the phone call ended. Another woman called, her voice trembling. "Please. I have children. Where will we go? Please don't take our house." I sat there holding the phone, the sound of her words hanging heavy in the air. I wasn't the one who put her in that situation, but now, I held her future in my hands. And that's when I realized, victory is not always sweet. Sometimes it tastes bitter. Sometimes it comes with responsibilities you never asked for. The HOA president, though, he didn't call me. He sent me a letter. Cold, formal, typed out with perfect words but filled with anger between the lines. He wrote, "This is not over. You may have won this round, but we will fight you in every way possible. We will appeal, we will challenge, we will not go down quietly." I read that letter twice, then laughed. Because it wasn't me who was quiet anymore. It was them who were trembling now. And no matter what appeal they tried, the deed was still mine. That truth could not be erased. But still, I knew this was far from over. The next day, I decided to walk through the neighborhood. Yes, the neighborhood that was now mine. As I walked down the sidewalk, people watched me from behind curtains. Some opened their doors halfway, whispering to their neighbors. A few brave ones stepped out. One man crossed his arms and said loudly, "You think you own us now?" I stopped, looked him in the eye, and replied softly, "I own the land. Not your soul. But your HOA lied to you, not me." He didn't answer. He just shook his head and went back inside. Another man, older, with gray hair, came forward slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. "So what happens now?" he asked me. I had no answer. And that was the hardest part. Because I had fought so long for justice, but I hadn't yet decided what justice should look like. Would I evict them? Would I demand payment? Would I sell the homes back at a price that punished the HOA? Or would I let them stay? I didn't know. Not yet. That night, I sat again at my kitchen table with the deed in front of me. But this time, it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a key. A key that could open many doors, some good, some bad. And whichever door I chose, would change hundreds of lives. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stared at the paper. My father's name was still there. My name was still there. But now, 100 more names were written in invisible ink, the names of families living in those 96 homes. The silence of the night pressed against my windows. And I asked myself, what is victory worth, if it makes me the villain in their eyes? My lawyer told me I had the legal right to do anything. But law is one thing, and humanity is another. And I knew the decision I made next would define me more than the victory in court ever could. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, what would my father do? The answer didn't come that night. But I knew one thing for sure, the battle with the HOA might have ended in court, but the real story, the real struggle, had only just begun. Because now, it wasn't about deeds and papers anymore. It was about people. And every single one of them was looking at me, waiting for my choice. But let me ask you this. If the power was in your hands, if 96 homes suddenly belonged to you, would you fight for revenge against the HOA, or would you forgive the families and let them stay? The days after the court ruling were heavy. Victory was mine, yes, but victory doesn't silence whispers. It only makes them louder. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. At the grocery store. At the gas station. Even when I walked past the park. People stared, whispered, pointed. Some looked at me with fear, some with anger, and some with quiet respect. It was strange. I had lived in this town my whole life, but now I felt like a stranger in my own home. The HOA president, oh, he wasn't done. He might have lost in court, but his pride refused to die. He began spreading lies. He told the families in those homes that I was coming to evict them all. He told them I was greedy, that I would sell the land to the highest bidder, that I wanted to destroy their lives. The fear grew like wildfire. Neighbors who once waved at me now closed their blinds when I passed. Children who used to ride bikes down the street now turned away when they saw me watching from the hill. The HOA had lost in law, but they were fighting me in the court of public opinion. And I could feel the pressure building. Letters began arriving in my mailbox. Some were begging me to show mercy. Some were angry, written in bold ink, calling me selfish, cruel, heartless. One letter had just 3 words on it: "You ruined us." I held that paper in my hands for a long time. My chest felt heavy. Because I knew it wasn't me who had ruined them, it was the HOA who had lied, cheated, stolen. But people don't always see the truth. They see the one standing on the hill holding the deed. And that was me. Then came the late-night knock on my door. I opened it slowly, and there stood the HOA president himself. His eyes were cold, but his smile was sharp. "Congratulations," he said softly, almost like a snake hissing. "But don't think this is the end. You may have won in court, but this community doesn't belong to you. They hate you. And soon, they'll turn on you." I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my hand gripping the doorframe, my other hand itching to slam it in his face. He leaned closer, his whisper colder now. "You don't belong here anymore." And with that, he walked away into the night. I closed the door slowly, my heart pounding. He wasn't threatening me with lawyers anymore, he was threatening me with people. With anger. With fear. The battle had shifted. The next morning, I drove through the neighborhood again. And that's when I saw it. Signs. Big, bold letters hammered into front yards. "Save our homes. Stop the landowner. We stand with HOA." Dozens of them. Lined up like soldiers in front of the very houses that sat on my land. It was almost funny. They were standing with the same HOA that had lied to them, stolen from them, ruined them. But anger doesn't always choose the right target. Sometimes it just chooses the closest one. And now, I was the target. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, staring at the deed. For months, it had been my weapon. For weeks, it had been my shield. But now, it felt like a curse. Because holding power means making choices. And every choice carried weight. I thought about tearing the deed in half. I thought about selling the land. I thought about letting the family stay, free of charge, just to end the hate. But then I thought of my father. And his words came back to me. "This land is not just land, it is our name. It is our honor. Never let anyone take it from you." Those words burned in my mind. Honor cannot be sold. Respect cannot be traded. So I stayed silent again, but this time, my silence was different. It wasn't patience. It wasn't strategy. It was a storm building inside me. Because the HOA president was right about one thing. I didn't belong anymore. Not in their eyes. Not in their world. And yet, it was all mine. The strange part was, not everyone turned against me. One evening, as I walked past the clubhouse, a woman stepped out. She was older, her hair silver, her voice calm. She said, "I know this isn't your fault. I know what they did. And I know you're not the villain they make you out to be." Her words were soft, but they cut through the noise. For the first time in weeks, I felt a crack of light in the darkness. Not everyone believed the lies. Not everyone hated me. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to make this right. But how? That was the question that kept me awake at night. How do you carry justice in one hand, and mercy in the other, without losing yourself? I looked down once more at the glowing lights of those 96 homes. They were mine, but they weren't mine. They were filled with lives that never asked for this fight. And deep inside, I knew, the hardest decision of my life was still waiting for me. But let me ask you something, if the whole neighborhood turned against you, if they saw you as the villain when you were really the victim, how would you handle it? Would you fight harder, or would you walk away and leave it all behind? The night the signs appeared, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the deed spread out on the table, the voices of the town echoing in my head. Accusations, anger, fear. It felt like the walls of my house were closing in on me, like even in my own home I was surrounded. By morning, I decided I couldn't hide anymore. I had stayed silent through construction. I had stayed silent through months of laughter and pride from the HOA. But now, silence wasn't working. So I drove down into the neighborhood. When I stepped out of my truck, all eyes turned. People stopped mowing lawns, children stopped riding bikes, conversations froze mid-sentence. It was like the air itself held its breath. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on the pavement, until I reached the center of the street where the HOA president was waiting for me. He had a small crowd behind him, neighbors with folded arms, people clutching those angry signs. His smile returned, that same sharp smile that had venom behind white teeth. "Look who decided to show his face," he said loudly, so everyone could hear. "The man who wants to steal your homes." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Eyes narrowed, fists clenched. I raised my hand, my voice steady. "I don't want to steal your homes. I never built this mess. Your HOA did. They lied to you. They built on land they didn't own. And now you want to blame me because the truth is too heavy to carry." The president stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Truth," he sneered. "The truth is, you're one man against 96 families. You can wave your little piece of paper around, but out here, you're alone." His words hung in the air like poison. The crowd nodded, some shouting, some cursing under their breath. But I didn't flinch. I leaned closer and whispered back to him, though loud enough for others to hear. "Alone with the truth is stronger than a crowd built on lies." For a moment, silence fell again. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice broke through. The older woman I had met days earlier. She stepped forward, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right," she said. "The HOA never showed us proof. They told us what they wanted us to believe. Maybe we should ask ourselves who really betrayed us." Gasps spread through the people. Some shook their heads, some argued, but her words had cracked the wall. Doubt had entered the room. The president's smile faltered. He turned to her, his voice sharp. "Don't let him trick you. He's trying to divide us. Stand with me, or everything you've built will collapse." But I could see it in their eyes. The cracks were spreading. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into doubt. And doubt is more dangerous than anger. The president's face reddened. He turned back to me, his voice rising. "You think you've won? You think this little victory in court makes you powerful? You don't belong here. You never will. And if you try to take these homes, you'll have to go through every single one of us." The crowd roared, some cheering him, some shouting in confusion, some still silent. I looked around slowly, meeting their eyes one by one. And then I spoke, not in anger, but in calm, steady words that carried farther than any shouting could. "You already know the truth. Deep inside, you know it. I'm not your enemy. I didn't put you here. I didn't trick you. I didn't steal from you. The people who did are standing right beside you, pretending to protect you. And you're too afraid to admit it." The silence that followed was louder than their shouts. Because when the truth is spoken, it echoes in hearts whether people want to hear it or not. I stepped back, turned, and walked to my truck. Nobody stopped me. Nobody blocked my way. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I kept walking, my boots steady, my shoulders straight. When I sat behind the wheel, I looked one last time in the rearview mirror. The crowd was still there, but divided now. Some still holding their signs high. Some lowering them slowly. Some looking at each other with questions written across their faces. And I knew a war had begun. Not in the courtroom. Not with deeds and papers. But in hearts and minds. And that war would be harder than any legal battle I had fought. That night, I stood on my porch again, the lights of the neighborhood glowing below. They were mine, legally. But belonging is more than law. Belonging is trust. And trust is the hardest thing to win back once it's broken. I clenched the deed in my hand, the paper crinkling under my grip, and whispered into the night. This is not finished. Because I knew the HOA president wouldn't stop. And I knew the families would keep looking at me like a villain until the truth sank in. And until then, every step I took would be a fight. But let me ask you this, if you stood face to face with a whole crowd, with voices shouting, accusing, hating, would you stand tall and speak the truth, or would you walk away to keep the peace? The night after that confrontation, the air felt different. The town was divided, the families were torn between anger and doubt, and the HOA president was losing control of the people he once commanded. But I knew something he didn't: pride doesn't survive cracks. Once trust breaks, it never heals the same. Days passed. Every morning I looked down from my hill, and I could feel the tension rising like smoke from every rooftop. Some families ignored me completely. Others started leaving letters at my gate, pleading for mercy. And a very few, actually thanked me quietly, admitting they had always suspected the HOA was hiding something. The president, though, wasn't done. He started knocking on doors, giving speeches in driveways, trying to rebuild his army. But every time he opened his mouth, more people began to question him. The seed of doubt was growing, and it was eating him alive. One evening, I heard shouting from the neighborhood below. I walked closer, standing just outside the entrance, and I saw it. The people were no longer shouting at me, they were shouting at him. You lied to us, one man yelled. Where's the proof you promised? Another demanded. The president raised his hands, sweating, stammering, trying to talk over them. But the louder he spoke, the less they listened. And then, the older woman with silver hair stepped forward again. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. We trusted you. You told us this land was yours to build on. You said no one could touch us. And now, look where we are. Silence followed her words. For the first time, the crowd turned its back, not on me, but on him. I watched from the shadows as the man who once ruled that community with pride now stood alone, abandoned by the very people he had used. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, his power broken. That was the day the HOA crumbled. Not in a courtroom. Not with a gavel. But in the hearts of the people who no longer believed his lies. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just turned and walked back up the hill, the sound of his downfall echoing behind me. Because my battle was never with the families. It was with him. And finally, he was finished. Weeks later, things began to change. Families started knocking on my door. Not with anger this time, but with questions. What happens now? Do we still get to live here? Can we stay? I sat with them, one by one, listening to their fears. They weren't my enemies. They were victims of his greed, just as I was. And for the first time, I realized, maybe my role wasn't to destroy, but to rebuild. So I made a choice. A choice that shocked everyone. I let them stay. Every family. Every home. But this time, it would be different. No HOA. No board filled with liars. No man standing in front pretending to own what was never his. I told them, you can live here, but you live under the truth now. You pay what's fair, and you respect what's real. This land will always carry my family's name. But it doesn't mean you can't call it home. Some cried. Some hugged me. Some still looked at me with doubt. But little by little, the anger faded. The fear softened. and trust began to grow again. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges. Some people resisted. Some still clung to the old HOA's promises. But most of them accepted the truth. And the neighborhood changed. The fancy clubhouse with its big banners? I tore them down. The signs that once read Ridgeline Heights? I replaced them with something simpler. A wooden board with 3 words carved into it. Land of Truth. Because that's what it had become. Not a place built on lies, but a place rebuilt on honesty. As for the HOA president, he left town quietly. No more speeches. No more suits. Just a broken man who finally realized pride can't stand against truth. And me? I still stand on my hill every morning. I still drink my coffee as the sun rises. But now, when I look down at those homes, I don't just see walls and roofs. I see families who know the truth. I see lives that carry respect for the land they live on. And I see peace, the kind of peace that only comes after a long, bitter war. But let me tell you this, victory doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes victory isn't about crushing your enemy. Sometimes it's about finding a way forward when the dust settles. Sometimes it's about turning pain into something new. And that's exactly what happened here. The land is still mine. The deed still carries my name. But those 96 homes? They carry the stories of people who learned the hard way, never to trust a lie again. And every time I see children running in the yards, or families sharing a meal on their porches, I smile quietly to myself. Because I know, even after everything, something good came out of it. But now I want to ask you, and I want you to really think about it. If you had been in my place, with the power to destroy everything the HOA built, would you have let those families stay, or would you have taken it all back for yourself?